In Vox today, our next guest, Ezra Klein, writes, the emphasis on the caravan reflects Trump's political choices, of course, but it also reflects the fact that the Republican Party is increasingly organized around a defensive version of white identity politics, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, and a whole lot more interested in protecting its numbers and borders than celebrating tax cuts. One Republican campaign source said this about the Trump anti-immigrant campaign message, said this to Politico: his honing in on this message is going to cost us seats, the people we need to win in these swing districts that will determine the majority. It's not the Trump base, it's suburban women or people who voted for Hillary Clinton or people who are not hard Trump voters. Joining our discussion now, Ezra Klein, editor-at-large at Vox and the host of the podcast, The Ezra Klein Show. Ezra, the attachment by Donald Trump to this argument is one that is infuriating, apparently, the establishment Republicans in Washington.
And it's endangering them. I think it's easy to forget that Donald Trump, he's been in politics like 10 minutes, right? His first campaign was a couple of years ago. And
he expressed surprise today, Ezra, at the very existence of midterm elections. You know?
Midterms, who knew?
Yeah,
How do they work? But the thing I think is interesting about that is that he ran a campaign in 2016 that was all about recognizing the way the other Republicans didn't, that the core of the Republican base, the issue that animated them most, was immigration. The Republican Party in that post-2012 autopsy, they were trying to moderate on immigration, and Donald Trump said, no, we're going to build a wall. We're going to make sure this country becomes more like it was, not more like the thing that you believe or you fear it's becoming. Donald Trump, he knows one thing. And so it's not all that surprising to me that in a moment of danger for him, for his party, that he's returning to that one thing that he knows works, and that's immigration.
Let's listen to what Beto O'Rourke said today about this. And here is someone who's running for Senate in the state where Donald Trump wants to build most of that wall that he's been dreaming about. Let's listen to Congressman O'Rourke.
This community especially, which bore witness to parents with their young children fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, making a 2,000-mile journey on foot atop a train known as the Beast or La Bestia, and if they survive, coming here to the front door of a country comprised of asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants the world over. Whether they came to the harbor in New York and saw the Statue of Liberty, or whether they first set foot in Chihuahuita or Segundo Barrio, that is who we are as a country.
And Ezra, he's delivering that message in Texas to Texas voters.
Yeah, I think there's something you're going to be seeing here. And you see it with Obama and Trump. I thought the clips you played of Obama earlier were speaking to this. And you're seeing it with some of the Democrats who are rising up, like Beto, like Gillum, and many others. There's going to be a fight for Democrats to define a version of national identity that acts as a counterpart to Donald Trump's sort of cramped defensive version of national identity. Donald Trump is saying there's an America we were, and that is the America we should be. And Democrats are going to need to find a message and a story about who we are, who we can be, that that manages to absorb who we're becoming without arousing those fears. Look, the Republican Party is increasingly a white identity politics party. That's what it has become. It's what it is doing. It's what works with its base. And it's not just Donald Trump at this point. It's what they're all doing. It's what they're all buying into, because the other thing doesn't work. They're not being able to change. They're not being able to grow. But we're in this sort of moment of demographic tipping in this country. I always think it's this remarkable statistic that under Obama, I think it was 2013 was the first year that a majority of infants in America were non-white. And so we're in this period where the nature, the composition of the country, and then of its political power is changing. But it hasn't yet changed. We're not like in the new space. We're in this period of transition. And so there are these stories that are fighting each other out. Donald Trump came in with this very pure but very defensive and very angry story. And I think you see Democrats like Beto trying to create a story that is more hopeful, more inclusive, that can speak about an America that is diversifying in a way that doesn't make people who have been here, people who are afraid of it, that doesn't bring them in as opponents. It manages to bring them in as allies.
And Ezra, you also wrote about a possible anti-democratic outcome when the votes are counted in the House races, where the Democrats could get more votes than the Republicans, but fewer seats. And this is something we've seen occur before. It could occur again. And you made a point about how the news media will react to that. That if the Democrats, even if they win millions more votes than the Republicans and do not get control of the House, the news media will react as if this is a Trump triumph.
Yeah, I think there are two levels to this. One is it's entirely possible we're going to be in January, and Republicans will have lost the popular vote at the House, in the Senate, and in the presidency, and control all three. And I think you're going to see a real legitimacy crisis beginning if that happens. I think Democrats are getting more and more fed up with winning the vote in elections and not winning power. And they're feeling increasingly the system is actually rigged against them, because on some level it actually is. But what you're pointing out is true, too. Look, you can imagine a world where Democrats win the popular vote in the House by 6 points and they win the majority, and a world where they win it by 7 points and they don't win the majority, right? It's all about where those votes are, whether or not they're distributed efficiently, how the gerrymandering breaks down. Like, there's a lot that goes into it. But if Democrats win that 7% gain but don't win the majority, it will be seen as a huge defeat for the party, where if they win the 6% but do win the majority, it will be seen as a huge win. In terms of power distribution, that's completely true. There's legitimacy to that narrative. But in terms of what the American people are actually saying, it's not true. And it speaks to the problem of trying to understand what is the voice of the American people through elections have become as distorted and strange as our midterm and gerrymandered election processes become.
Ezra Klein, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.